Hi there. In this video, we are going to learn about Route 53. To understand the functionality of Route 53, you need to know few things about DNS or domain name system. So, if you are absolutely new to DNS, I suggest that you read about the basics of DNS or watch some informational videos on it and then come back to this video. For this course, however, you do not have to dive deep into the DNS. As long as you know some of the important concepts, you should be okay. And we are going to cover few fundamental concepts as part of this course. So what is Route 53? Well, it is Amazon's highly available and scalable domain name system web service. So what does it do? Well, it does three things. First, it registers domain names. Second, it routes the internet traffic to the resources for your domain. So it has some inbuilt routing policies that you can leverage and determine how the traffic should be flown among your resources once the DNS query comes in. Third and last, it checks the health of your resources. So Route 53 ensures that the traffic to the website or to your domain gets routed to only the healthy instances. Now note that you can use Route 53 to register your domain name and to route internet traffic for the domain, but that domain does not have to be registered using Route 53. There are many concepts that I will be covering as part of this video which are very essential to understand the overall DNS as well as Route 53. Please do not get overwhelmed with the sheer number of concepts on your screen. We will go one by one, and I am sure it is very easy to understand those concepts. Domain name. What is a domain name? Well, it is the address a user types in the address bar to access a website or a web application, right? For example, google.com or wizlabs.com, etc. To make your website or web application available on the internet, you start by registering a domain name, and we are going to register a domain name further in this course. If google.com is a domain name, then what is a top level domain? Well, the last part of the domain name is the top level domain. That is, for google.com or wizlabs.com, .com is the top level domain. Some of the other top level domains or TLDs are .com, .org, .net, etc. A subdomain is a domain name that has one or more labels prepended to the registered domain name. For example, for google.com, maps.google.com or images.google.com are its subdomains. Remember that www.google.com is also a subdomain, which usually points to the home screen of the main domain name. Domain registrar. It is a company that is accredited by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, in short called as ICANN, to process domain registrations for specific top-level domains. For example, Amazon Registrar Incorporated is a domain registrar for .com, .net, and .org domains. There are many other registrars available through which you can register your domains. Domain registry. Domain registry is a company that owns the right to sell domains that have a specific top-level domain. For example, VeriSign is a domain registry. Name servers. Name servers are the servers in the DNS that help to translate domain names into the IP addresses. We are going to see how name servers play a key role in DNS query resolving just a bit in few minutes. Authoritative name server. An authoritative name server is a name server that has definitive information about one part of the domain name system and that responds to requests from a DNS resolver by returning the applicable information. So, whenever a name server comes with a DNS query for a top level domain such as .com or .org, a name server knows exactly the name of the name servers that are responsible for managing those .com or .org top level domains. A DNS resolver is a DNS server which is often managed by an internet service provider or ISP, that acts as an intermediary between the user request and the DNS name servers. DNS query. In short, a DNS query is a request that is submitted by the user to the DNS for a resource that is associated with the domain name. So whenever a user or a browser sends out a request for an IP address that corresponds to a website, that particular request is considered as the DNS query. DNS record. A DNS record basically defines how you want to route the traffic for your domain or subdomain. So if you have a website called example.com and a subdomain of www.example.com, using the DNS records, you can control the logic and you can define which resources that traffic should go to. Time to live. Time to live or TTL is the amount of time that is measured in terms of seconds that you want the DNS resolver to cache the values for a record before submitting another request to Route 53 to get the current values of that record. For example, if a DNS server has an entry for, let's say, example.com as the IP address of 192.0.2.234, that particular record is going to be cached at the DNS server for this amount of seconds. Once this period is passed, then that DNS server can send out a request via Route 53 to fetch the latest value for that record. What is an A record then? An A record or authoritative record basically maps a domain or subdomain to an IP address. For example, it might map www.wizlabs.com to 69.11.66.143, etc. Cname record or canonical name record also does the mapping, but it does mapping between a domain or a subdomain name to another domain or subdomain name. For example, it might map pictures.wizlabs.com to images.wizlabsinternal.com. Alias record is a type of record which belongs in AWS that you can create with Amazon Route 53 to route the traffic to AWS resources. For example, you might route the traffic to your website to, say, CloudFront distribution or an Elastic Load Balancer or S3 buckets, etc. Zone Apex. Zone Apex, or sometimes called as naked domain name, is just the root domain. Routing policy. Routing policy is basically a setting for records that determines how Route 53 responds to DNS queries and routes the traffic. So it's a routing logic that you define via all your A records or alias records, etc. In the subsequent videos, we are going to learn how each routing policy works in Route 53. So what is DNS like? Well, we know that in global networking, the computers are identified by IP addresses, not by their name. We all know that every website has a corresponding IP address. However, it is virtually impossible to remember the IP addresses of each website. So, human beings cannot always keep typing the IP addresses while browsing, can they? No, right? So, this is where DNS becomes very handy. It does the job of mapping the human readable domain names such as Amazon.com or Wizlabs.com to IP addresses. So, DNS works like a phone book directory. Before we dive deep into how Route 53 works, it is very important that you understand how exactly does the DNS query gets resolved. When a user types in, say, wizlabs.com in the address bar of the web browser, that computer or machine first checks its local cache to see if there is any mapping between wizlabs.com and an IP address. If there is a mapping, well and good. But if not, that computer asks the name resolving server, in this case an internet service provider, hey, do you know the IP address of wizlabs.com? The name resolving server is then going to check its own cache to see if it has that mapping. If it is not there, it takes that query to the root server. The root server sits at the top of the domain hierarchy. That is, root server keeps the track of all the top level domain servers. For example, .com servers or .org servers, etc. So when the query comes to it, it sends the IP address of the server that is managing the top level domain, that is .com, back to the name resolving server. The name resolving server then forwards the same query to the top level domain server asking for the IP address of wizlabs.com. The top level domain server responds saying that, hey, I don't know the IP address of wizlabs.com, but I can give you the IP address of the authoritative name server that knows about all the yahoo.com or wizlabs.com. So the top level server forwards the authoritative name server's IP address to the name resolving server. The name resolving server then asks the authoritative name server if it knows the IP address of wizlabs.com. Since it has the final authority of the IP address, it forwards the IP address of wizlabs.com to the name resolving server. Finally, the name resolving server forwards that IP address back to the computer. But then it stores it in its own cache for resolving any future queries for wizlabs.com. And then it caches that mapping in its own local cache. Now here remember that it will keep that entry or the mapping in its own cache only for the duration that is mentioned in the time to live in the record. So once the time to live period gets expired, the cache becomes invalid, and at that time the name resolving server is again going to query for the IP address corresponding to wizlabs.com.